So, welcome, Daniel Howard James. I'm delighted that you've agreed to have a conversation with me. You recently read one of my Substacks, didn't you, about the borderline process
Mm.
operating in activists. And you asked me, had I been present at your disciplinary process because it resonated so strongly, some of the things I wrote about.
Mm.
You're a researcher, you're an editor, you're an author, and a former journalist, technical journalist, and you write a lot for. Well, you've got a prolific Substack. The articles that drew me to you are mainly about gender
Mm.
ideology and trans ideology, but you write more broadly about that. You write about whatever you fancy writing about, whatever interests you, don't you?
That's right.
That's political
Mm.
or cultural. Um, Now, the experience we're going to be talking about is when you were a parish councillor and you were a
That's right.
parish councillor for 8 years,
Mm.
stepped down a year ago. And one of your colleagues made some comments on Facebook. There
That's
was a
right.
consultation going on, wasn't there, about the Gender Recognition Act, the
Mm.
reform of it. So we're going back to 2017. And one of your colleagues had quite a bit to say about that on Facebook. And you stepped in
Mm.
to support or speak up for her, didn't you? So please, will you share with me that experience?
Certainly. So, I'd studied psychology. One of my specialities was gender psychology, under the feminist Lynn Siegel, who taught at Middlesex University, as it now is. And
Hmm.
I was there in the early 90s, just at the same time as queer theory was going sort of mainstream in UK academia. And postmodernism more generally. So I was really interested in gender because I'd been volunteering for a day centre for homeless people
Right.
in my hometown.
Hmm.
This was in 1990 when I was doing my psychology A level, and there was a transgender person who was working alongside me as a fellow volunteer who had been homeless and had then found accommodation and become a volunteer in the day centre. So that was my first experience of transgender people in real life. And then after graduating, I was working in a computer center because I was really disillusioned with psychology by that point.
Hmm.
I've just been through all the various schools of thought, as it were, and I found them very limited
Hmm.
and in conflict with each other a lot of the time. And so I didn't see myself working in that field. So I ended up working in this computer center where we were kind of helping people with publishing books and websites and things like that. And a transgender person came in asking for help with their website. They had recently published a book themselves, and so we got talking about that, and they said that very few people were willing to help them because this is still the 1990s. There wasn't the awareness of transgender people that there is today. So I got to know them, and I helped them with their website and their book launch and so on. And so I was not in any way opposed to transgender people, and not I don't have to take the same position as some radical feminists who find the very existence of transgender people offensive.
Hmm.
But so I was pretty supportive actually, and so when I was sort of getting back involved with the Green Party again because I had been a member as a student in the mid sort of 1990s. Um, so I was in a place where the local party wasn't very active, but it was being sort of re-energized around 2014. And so I got involved, and then I discovered that the culture had moved on quite a lot. And this is being 2014, this was a sort of a peak year for transgender activism.
Hmm.
There's a lot of breakthroughs were made by transgender people into political parties and things like that.
Hmm.
And in the Green Party, there was one particular activist called Amy Challoner,
Hmm.
who was very young, very prominent, rose up very quickly through the ranks, and made a bid for deputy leader of the party, which was quite an audacious thing for a teenager to do. But they had a lot of support from people calling themselves transgender allies. So not transgender people, but people who wanted to push transgender people like Amy into the limelight. And this was something I reflected on when reading your article about the ego states, because Amy was a person who had quite a troubled early life and was still very young. And I remember one incident, I wasn't there, but I was told about it, where it was in the middle of a political conference and Amy was not getting their way. And Amy laid on the floor and like screamed and cried and like banged the floor like a toddler would.
Yeah.
And this, but then it was probably like, I don't know, 17, 18 at the time or
Mhm.
something. And this was like really disturbing because up till then, the Green Party had been a place of sort of, thoughtful, considerate, quite, sort of bookish people. And these kind of displays of like raw emotion and sort of toddler behavior were just
Mhm.
really out of character for the party. But there was a whole debacle after that with Amy and her father, who was sort of her they him, I don't know. I don't know what pronoun Amy uses today.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
their election agent
Right.
and David. Okay, I'll just say Amy's father, David,
Mhm.
was arrested for various offences, and I think the prison sentence that David got was over 20 years, and
Right.
it involved some very serious abuse.
Right.
And so Amy subsequently left the party, went to the Liberal Democrats, which was another UK political party, and then I think left UK politics altogether. But there was quite a turmoil, and the thing is that after Amy left, the allies, the people who were not transgender but really wanted to push for sort of transgender ideology for their own reasons, they were still very prominent in the
Mm.
party. So a friend of mine in the local Green Party was a transgender person, and there was a bit of a culture clash because older transgender people used different language to the
Mhm.
sort of new cohort of activists. And I
Uh-huh.
remember once this person referred to themselves as a female impersonator, and this was considered very offensive by the activists who were not actually transgender,
Mhm.
but were all about the ideology.
Yeah.
But that was just the sort of the older generation of transgender people would use that phrase to describe somebody who performed on stage.
Mm.
So
You're just reminding me,
yeah.
Daniel, of an experience I had at a local library. I,
Hmm.
I joined a protest against drag queen story time.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of activists with huge, big bannery type flags
Mm.
who would just come and cover us up completely. They really,
Right. Yes.
and very aggressively
Mm.
wanted to silence us while the police stood by very passively. And I took a little breather and I walked up to the corner of the street. And a trans woman came up to me and of the older generation.
Mm.
And she said, "Thank you so much for what you're doing." She said, "I'm sick
Mm.
and tired of my identity being exploited."
Mm.
She
Yeah.
just wanted a quiet life.
Mm.
She passed very easily as a female and just didn't want all this
Mm.
activism and attention, negative attention as she saw it,
Right.
drawn to the trans community. So that's just illustrating the difference in the
Oh, I know exactly what you mean because a lot of transgender people just want to get on with
we
their
had a little
lives,
cry
you know.
together.
Okay. Well, this is the interesting thing about many of the so-called allies. They don't actually like or respect actual transgender people,
Mhm.
often because they're in dispute with them over this or that aspect of the ideology. So, as I'm saying, female impersonator was sort of a trade name that we'd use if you had a stage act like a Danny LaRue or Dame Edna Everage or someone like that, and it was distinct from a drag queen as some was somebody who would do sort of rude or blue material, as it was called, in a strip club or a gay club or something like that. So a female impersonator was a mainstream entertainer.
Yeah.
Through the 60s and 70s, there were various people who did what we would now call drag, but they didn't consider themselves as drag artists because there was this distinction. But the new generation activists didn't understand that.
Hmm.
So they were really very negative and critical about this actual transgender person, despite the fact they considered themselves allies.
Yeah.
And this person that I knew as a friend of mine, their partner had met them while doing hair and makeup for transgender people, trans women, as they would now be called, which is a sort of sort of what brought them together because this person was had their stage act and their cabaret, and the other person was hairdressing, makeup for these men who were doing these sort of stage shows.
Mm.
And so they ended up getting together, and she was a councillor, like I was in a town council just sort of up the road, and there was a Facebook discussion between these activists, these so-called transgender allies, and the partner of a transgender person, in which they were attacking this councillor. So it got out of hand, and she made a comment about specifically about toilets. Now, when you're on a town council or a parish council, you're often responsible for public toilets
Mm.
in your town.
Mm.
And so this is actually a live issue because you are doing things like setting policy for how toilets should be used in a street or in a sports centre or a village hall or whatever. So this is sort of underneath your remit.
Mhm.
And the problem was that she made this comment saying that if you have a penis, you should use the gents, meaning the gentleman's toilet, the men's toilet.
Mm.
And the activists, the sort of the so-called allies, um, initiated a massive pile-on of her personally.
Mm.
And of course, this also affected her partner, who was transgender. And then there was a hit piece written by an alleged news website called Pink News,
Yes.
which is a particularly pro-activist and sort of I suppose you would call it a woke publication.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
they did a full feature on my friend who was the counsellor, and they said how awful she was and how horrible and transphobic and disgusting, all these kind of things. I'm paraphrasing,
Hmm.
but they basically featured her picture, and they basically accelerated the pile-on, so that
Mm.
all these people on Facebook and social media were all like having a go at her in a very quite a vindictive way,
Mm.
and that affected her health, but also the health of her partner, who is transgender, and so these so-called allies were actually harming a transgender person and their partner.
Mhm.
And I stepped in a Facebook comment or something like that, and I said this particular comment that she'd made about hairy-arsed blokes
Right.
was light-hearted.
Hmm.
And because I knew them really well, and we'd worked side by side on local political campaigns and things like that.
Hmm.
I knew that they didn't have a vindictive bone in their body. And they're certainly not transphobic because
Hmm.
one was transgender, one was the partner of a transgender person. So it was kind of ridiculous that they were being piled on as these so-called transphobes.
Hmm.
But as a result of my comment saying that this was a light-hearted post on Facebook, I then became the subject of disciplinary action as well within the Green Party's internal
Right.
disciplinary system.
Hmm.
And that's when the whole Kafkaesque aspect of it became apparent because I then had to go through a hearing. There was various sort of manipulation, so I couldn't
Was
actually
it was
attend
it,
my own
it
hearing. And
very was it a very formalized hearing? Did you know what to expect? Were you given guidelines? Because I've come across so many of these procedures that are
mm,
so extraordinarily ad hoc,
mm,
um, where normal rules are
right.
abandoned. I wonder what yours was like.
Well, it was a bit of a kangaroo court. At the time, the Green Party didn't have that many staff working on things like disciplinary action. And because I was a councillor, there was the prospect of being sort of disavowed or whatever you call it, so that I would no longer be a Green Party councillor, so I'd be kicked out and so on, or suspended or whatever, which was I didn't think was right because I had stood for election, I had been elected,
Yes.
and I felt that I should be able to sort of carry on doing that and have my say. So there were various shenanigans involved, and there was no um, sort of innocent until proven guilty aspect to it. So on the day of the actual hearing, which was I said I won't go to. I had to go to London if I wanted to be there in person. I said I'm not going to do that. I'll do it over Zoom, and they did not send me the link to attend. So it was
Mm.
held in absentia. So I didn't get to speak on my own behalf. But even then, the disciplinary panel decided that I was not guilty or I had no case to answer or whatever, because I had just been sticking up for my fellow councillor against this quite vicious social media onslaught.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the process was the punishment. I didn't
Yes.
actually get suspended,
Mm-hmm.
but the all of the having to prepare my case and all that kind of thing was designed to, annoy me or upset me in some way, I assume. And it was all rather ridiculous because I had only been defending somebody who was, in no way transphobic or whatever. But that was the word they would always use. You're transphobic.
Mm-hmm.
You're, it's tantamount to genocide or whatever. And
It's
there's a
such
lot
a
of very
it's such a
immature
it's
behavior.
such a process stopping phrase, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
No. Mm.
I mean, I would say it's completely inappropriate because a phobia is an irrational fear,
Mm-hmm.
and as all psychologists know,
Mm-hmm.
and I was neither fearful nor hateful of transgender people,
Mm-hmm.
and the any argument I would make, I would like to think was a rational one,
Mm-hmm.
but it was just like pointing a finger and saying you're a witch, essentially, burn the witch, and I've got it very lightly. Compared to other people that have lost their livelihoods or, been denied funding opportunities and things like that. So it
Mm-hmm.
was I don't make myself into a martyr about
Mm-hmm.
it, but
Mm-hmm.
it was frustrating and it did show the direction of travel when a complaint system can be weaponized by activists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The whole I experienced some of the pile-on myself when I stood for chair of UKCP. There was an open letter put online, and every trace of me on the web
Mm,
was weaponized against me.
mm,
Even down to what I think is quite a sweet little podcast that I do
mm,
or did, Man Made, and it's
mm,
MAID, because I'm interested in men's issues and
mm,
their disadvantage, which is
mm,
largely invisible, I think, and not taken seriously. But yeah, the kind of attempt to damage my reputation and all the similar names that
mm,
I'm transphobe and homophobe and all those kind of things.
mm.
And I don't think any one of those signatures belonged to anyone who knew me.
Right, it wouldn't do. And
No.
the ironic thing is that they're always complaining about bullying or
Yes.
whatever, but then
Hmm.
orchestrating like campaigns against
Hmm.
individuals
Hmm.
from with random strangers, attacking people. Like as you say, they've never had a chance to listen to, but they
No.
don't want to listen. They don't want to even listen to the actual transgender people involved,
Mm.
which shows that it's not really about um, transgender people themselves. It's a sort of leverage
Hmm.
against people that you disagree with on some ideological point.
Hmm. Hmm. So there's a there's massive exploitation, isn't there,
Mm,
of
yes, I agree.
trans people.
Mm,
Um, so there was other things I would quite like to talk to you about. But, um, you write about colonization, and I'm often saying that I feel my profession, the psychological professions, have been colonized by
mm,
ideologues, ideological activists, and you had something interesting to say before we started recording about that
Yes.
word. So would you
Yeah.
share a bit more about that?
Well, I've been researching gender in places like Southeast Asia,
Hmm.
which are places like Singapore, which were obviously colonies of the British initially, or the in other places it was the Dutch, and
Yeah.
so on. And I've come to the conclusion that colonizer is just a word for someone you don't like. So it's like a pejorative. So when people act or they move around the world or do things, they're always having an influence.
Hmm.
And so we can frame that negatively if we want and call them a colonizer, implying that they were only, exploiting people or, they were doing
Hmm.
no good whatsoever or anything they did actually contribute or build is framed in negative terms. But
Hmm.
I think in the context of gender, it's quite interesting that um, the different waves of colonizers, as they called it, had different approaches to different groups within those places. So, for example,
Hmm.
um, the British, when they were in India, they wanted to phase out the dedication of young girls into what's now called sex work,
Hmm.
prostitution, because there were rituals or traditions around taking a very young girl and putting her into a sort of uh, an arrangement with an older man
Hmm.
that would now be considered sort of exploitation or prostitution.
Hmm.
And it was often when you had a poor family and there would be like, they would have a lot of daughters and they would basically sell one of the daughters to an older man with money in the community. And this is this is something that the Raj, the sort of British imperial powers, said, no, I think
Yeah.
that's not compatible with our Christian ethos, and
Hmm.
we want you to stop doing that. And that is illegal in modern India because after the Raj, um, the new Indian government did actually try and phase that out, but it's still the case that you've got women in that situation today.
Hmm.
And there are now, I wrote about a self-help group in India for young, well, they're older women now, but they were dedicated to this sort of practice
Hmm.
as young girls, sometimes as young as 7 years old,
Hmm.
and they were basically sold into this way of life.
Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed about the so-called transgender allies is they're also extremely pro-prostitution,
Hmm.
and they will use phrases like "sex work is work"
Yes.
alongside trans women are women and so on.
Mm.
And so one of the things I've been writing about with colonization is how the idea of transgender people is actually bound up with this sex trade
Mm.
in colonial cultures,
Mhm.
and that's why you'll often see people arguing for quite extreme positions on transgenderism that even transgender people don't agree with, and
Mhm.
also being extremely pro prostitution. So when
Mhm.
I was a contractor for Amnesty International,
Ah.
working on their publishing side of things. And while I was doing that, they brought out a report about sort of violence against transgender people in Brazil.
Mhm.
And specifically, they're talking about males who transition to feminine. They're not talking about trans men, as they're now called. But the in quite a lot of places around the world, trans women are involved in prostitution. And the argument is that this is because, the society is transphobic, therefore they can't get any other work. But
Mhm.
that's not really true because in a lot of cultures, particularly in Southeast Asia, transgender people are actually held in quite high esteem
Mhm. Mhm.
traditionally, and they
Yes.
have religious or cultural roles. Not
Yeah.
always the case. I mean, it's in India, for example,
Mhm.
trans women are often involved in prostitution there as well.
Mhm.
But this particular report from Amnesty International was written from a very sort of activist standpoint, basically arguing that these transgender people in Brazil were being harmed or even murdered
Hmm.
because of transphobia.
Hmm.
And actually, it had more to do with the fact that they were living very precarious lives in prostitution.
Hmm.
And so you end up with these activists who are very, they say they're transgender people and they say that they're pro-sex workers, as they would
Hmm.
call them, but they don't actually want to help people exit that situation
Hmm.
because they consider that to be bigoted and harmful and hateful and so on. And so we've got this very strange alignment where some of the most oppressed and endangered humans
Hmm.
are left in these very dangerous conditions because ideologically we're all supposed to cheer for people, being transgender and in prostitution,
Yeah.
as if that's like them living their best life,
Yes.
and it's just it doesn't make a lot of sense until you
No.
sort of dig deeper into it and find out what they're aiming for.
This seems to be such a theme of harm being
Hmm.
ignored, whether that's
Yes.
young people um, being prescribed puberty blockers with
Hmm.
sex hormones,
Yes.
um, having brutal surgery normalized,
Mm.
um, the blurring of the boundaries as well. Um, the memorandum of understanding, I'm sure you know this, makes no distinction between children and adults. So there's the same policy, their policy
Hmm.
of being anti-conversion therapy, which
Mm.
to a traditional psychotherapist like me means no exploration allowed.
Right.
It doesn't differentiate between adult and child. So
Mm.
that's a serious safeguarding issue
Well,
to
indeed, and that was because of what happened with David Challoner in the Green Party. This was, a discussion that we absolutely needed to have, but of
Mhm.
course the activists didn't want to go there, and you'll find that many of them don't actually believe in the concept of childhood. They're opposed to any age of consent,
Yeah.
and so this goes back to the 70s, and Michel Foucault famously supported men who were in prison
Yes.
for sex offences,
Mhm.
arguing that the concept of an age of consent was an absurdity. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, there's been a lot of sort of a lot of legacy harm
Mhm.
from the new left of the 60s and the 70s.
Mhm.
In Germany as well, there were some notorious communes and so on that argued for sort of no age of consent,
Mhm.
and for
Mhm.
children to be involved in adult relationships and so on.
Yes.
And so there are gigantic red flags waving
Yeah.
over a lot of this stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so if you've got people saying it's actually okay to inject children with hormones, it's actually okay to not have an age of consent, and actually sex work is okay, and
Mhm.
um, you know, so the all the logical consequence of this is a sort of Crowleyite
Mhm.
Satanism,
Mhm.
and I don't use that phrase in the sense of a satanic panic, but I just mean in that
Mhm.
sense of
Mhm.
um, you know, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and these are people who are basically arguing for no boundaries whatsoever.
There's certainly a kind of anti-humanism
Mm,
aspect to it, isn't there?
yeah, and
I
I
would
go.
go. I,
So I was going to say, I mean, it's very motivated reasoning in my view, because there are people who either get arrested or go to prison or are at risk of being arrested and going to prison
Mhm.
for what our society has deemed to be unacceptable
Mhm.
behavior regarding boundaries
Mhm.
with young people and with all kinds of other sexual behaviors like choking
Yes.
and all those activities associated with sadomasochism.
Mhm.
And there's actually quite a long history of lawfare in the UK. The group Liberty, which is used to be called the National Council for Civil Liberties, it's like the British equivalent to the ACLU. They actually took a case on behalf of sadomasochists all the way to the European courts and
Right.
lost, basically arguing that anybody should be able to participate in consensual sadomasochism, and they should agree, if they want to being hurt by
Mhm.
somebody that they supposedly cared for them.
Mhm.
And so this is not new. This has been going on for a long time, but
Mhm.
I think it's particularly prominent within the sort of the people who call themselves the transgender allies.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to call them people who are transgender rights activists, because
Mhm.
actually they seem to be about dismantling rights
Mhm.
for certain individuals in favor
Mhm.
of others. So, it's not necessarily the case that transgender people actually benefit from having more
Mhm.
surgeries, for example, just because they've been given the right to
Mhm.
do that in the context of masochism, because there are clearly some people who are quite disturbed
Yeah.
and they don't react in a normal emotional way to the prospect of being hurt, for example.
Exactly. Mhm.
So if you say to somebody, this surgery, there's quite a high risk that you'll suffer some serious medical complications.
Mhm.
A masochist doesn't process that in the same way that an average person would do.
Mhm.
And in fact, for some people, the more they're hurt, the better.
Mhm.
And
Or
so
even
that's quite dangerous.
even a young mind
Mhm.
might deny that. It won't happen to me. Or
Well, there are two different phenomenon, aren't there? You've got the unrealistic optimism of youth,
Mhm.
where when I was a student, one of the researchers at the university was studying the cohort of young men that steal cars,
Oh yeah.
joyriders,
Mm.
as they were called,
Mm.
and their unrealistic optimism about what would happen if they crashed, what would happen if the police caught them, things
Mm.
like that. And they were basically focused on what they wanted, which was
Mhm.
some excitement and adventure
Yes.
from stealing cars and driving them very fast.
Yes.
And if the police chased them, all the better,
Mhm.
because that just made it more exciting.
Mhm.
And they were very young; they were like say 14 or 15 years old, and they weren't actually thinking through the consequences of what
Yeah.
would happen if they crashed the car. With the injuries that they might receive, or they might have to go to prison or something like that.
Yeah.
So you've got that phenomenon, haven't you, in the younger
Yeah.
people where
They
they're
haven't yet
basically,
developed the capacity
yeah,
to think of consequences. Yeah.
yes, or if they do think about them, they're just very unrealistic about them. So it's like you say, it won't happen to me.
Mm.
And then you've got the other phenomenon of masochism, which can continue throughout life, where people are disturbed in a way that means that they take a certain pleasure in being hurt or being
Mhm.
dominated,
Mhm.
or being sort of ordered around or
Mhm.
whatever. And I think you see that in some of the cases of exploitation with adults involved, where they end up going to prison or whatever, and it's quite clear that they're not mentally well,
Mhm.
but the judicial system doesn't consider them insane enough to put into a sort of like a secure psychiatric facility. So they
Mhm.
sort of fall between two stools. And I hear from people that work in prisons and things like that. They say a lot of people that are in here, they've just got so many mental health issues,
Mhm.
but the prison is not the right place
Mhm.
to treat that. It's not designed for that. And a lot of them wouldn't even be here
Mhm.
if we had a system
Mhm.
that could actually help
Mhm.
them.
Mhm.
So,
In the late 70s, I worked for NACRO, for
mhm.
National Association. What is it?
Care and rehabilitation of
Repair and
offenders.
Rehabilitation of
It's
Offenders.
like a probation charity,
Yeah,
isn't it?
and
They
there
kind
and
of.
there really was the idea of rehabilitation in those days, the
Mm,
possibility of supporting people emotionally and
mm,
practically, education, developing skills. Um, but that disappeared
mm,
probably 20 or more years ago,
mm,
where it's just punishment now, isn't it? There's no other care, support, thought for the future
mm.
of offenders. Mm.
Well, I suppose the problem is if you have the attitude that all behavior is essentially permissible,
Yeah.
and that people have a choice to have a certain way of life,
Yes.
then how can you rehabilitate them? Because you have to start from a position that the behavior that they've
Hmm.
carried out has been the cause of their legal
Hmm.
problems or their
Hmm.
incarceration.
Hmm.
And then you address that, and you
Mhm.
hope that they don't come back
Yeah.
into the prison setting. But
Yeah.
if you start from the premise that actually all behavior is permissible,
Mhm.
then you're more likely to take against the prison system itself and call for
Mhm.
the abolition of prisons, for example.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because you basically don't believe that anything should be against the law.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of that in progressive politics. This
Mhm.
idea that it's basically it's inappropriate to
Mhm.
punish anybody
Mhm.
um, with the state or
Mhm.
with
Yeah.
imprisonment,
Yeah.
and so you can't rehabilitate people. And it's
Mhm.
the same. I mean, Anne Marie Ward has written about this a lot because she works on drug policy in Scotland.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, if your um, government takes the view that people are entitled to take as many drugs as they want and the harm is irrelevant to that, you can't rehabilitate people from sort of drug abuse
Mhm.
problems
Mhm.
because you're basically saying it's their individual right to take as many drugs as they want. So how can you rehabilitate them? You can only say, okay, well, we'll give you safe needles, or
Mhm.
we'll give you
Mhm.
a weekly dose of the drug of your choice
Mhm.
from a doctor.
Mhm.
So, and in the same way, if someone's got inappropriate sexual behavior,
Mhm.
um, if you take the view that there's no such thing as inappropriate sexual behavior,
Yes.
how can you address that?
Yeah,
And
I've been
so,
I've been wanting to share something. The
mm,
main provider of sex therapy training in the UK. I had sight of some of their training
mm,
slides, and the normalization of fetishes was
mm,
really strong.
yeah,
There was sexual relationships with the dog talked about very
hmm,
matter-of-factly,
oh yes,
and participants were informed that the golden retriever was the most popular, dog of choice, with
too
without a
much information, isn't it?
without a
Yeah, yeah,
breast eyelid, without any question.
hmm,
Well, it's delivered in a way that you don't question it.
right,
And more alarming than that was there's a category TNG, which
hmm,
stands for the next generation, all listed
okay.
as fetishes to be met without judgment.
Yeah, well, that's coming from that sort of Foucault
Yeah.
kind of attitude in
Hmm.
abnormal history of
Hmm.
sexuality, his sort of multi-volume work. All
Hmm.
those kind of ideas have come through, and I think
Hmm.
the one of the mistakes that the Thatcher government made in the 80s with its sort of anti-gay legislation, Section 28,
Hmm.
was that it didn't drill down enough into the problem.
Hmm.
So it said that teachers can't talk about homosexuality,
Uh-huh.
um, but there was no, there was, I mean, there was no understanding of what was really going on, I don't think, with the groups like Paedophile Information Exchange, which were very active at that time and were actually affiliated to Liberty.
Hmm.
They even ran adverts in Liberty's publications for people to join this network of paedophiles.
Hmm.
And so, without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, um, the opportunity was missed, I think, to actually
Hmm.
drill down on it because there was a public campaign against Section 28 where people were saying, "Oh, isn't it terrible that Thatcher doesn't like the gays?"
Hmm.
But I think the government at the time they didn't go deep enough into the issue to understand what was going on
Hmm.
then,
Yeah.
and so they came up with this kind of quite blunt legislation. But in retrospect, you can see that they were sort of like identified the problem, but they came
Hmm.
up with the wrong solution, which was to make homosexuality itself the problem.
Yes.
And what they really should have been doing is looking into the abuse of children, for
Yes.
example.
Right.
And that obviously all came to a head with cases like the Jimmy Savile case
Hmm.
and various other celebrities involved who all sort of cruised through the 1980s without, any ever being challenged.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, with hindsight, we can see that actually there was a problem that needed to be addressed.
Hmm.
But now we've sort of the pendulum's swung so far in the other direction that you have
Hmm.
sort of government-funded publications, promoting the idea that all this is sort of normal, natural, and healthy.
Hmm.
But I think even on a sort of animal rights level,
Hmm.
you could suggest that maybe it's not the best idea to be having sex with a dog. for example, and I mean there was a case, quite a sad case recently in the UK of a man who did die in an alleyway
Hmm.
after an encounter with a dog.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it was also a drag queen. So
Hmm.
that's sadly where these things end up, isn't it? And
Absolutely.
I
And
think the so-called allies would say, brilliant, you do you, you're
mm,
living your best life,
mm,
but this person has died, um, far before their time. So
yeah,
you have to wonder what their end goal would be.
mm,
Are
exactly.
there any taboos that they wouldn't break?
Yeah,
You know, how
yeah.
far would
Where
they want to push this?
where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries? And children again
Mm,
are being affected in the worst possible ways
mm,
by this ideology, by it being propagated in schools,
mm,
by the idea of the family being passé
mm,
and not taken seriously, their medication
mm.
for any number of uh, diagnoses, you
Well,
know,
yes, quite. I
and
mean, it's kind of sad, isn't it? The children are bombarded with all of this,
mhm,
and then when they can't cope, the solution is, oh, just take a tablet.
yes,
Take your medication, and you'll feel much better about it.
yes,
When I think children are quite right to be anxious
yes,
if they're being fed all of this material because
yeah,
it's not. I mean, it's intentionally destabilizing, isn't it?
mhm,
That is the goal
mhm,
of queer theory,
exactly,
quite explicitly,
exactly,
to dissolve boundaries and
yeah,
to make everybody sort of polymorphously perverse.
yeah,
So they're not shying away from that.
no,
So I
no,
think
I,
it's it needs addressing.
yeah, and I'm so glad there are people like you and I who are attempting to hold back the flood,
Hmm.
who are attempting to hold
Yeah.
the boundaries. I'm quite a bit older than you, I think. I don't think I'm just a grumpy old woman. I don't think I'm just resistant to change. I think there is
Yeah.
something really valuable that and worthwhile to preserve, particularly in my profession,
Mm.
particularly in the care of children. And I know you're very active, aren't you, in the puberty blockers.
Well, I've written quite a lot about that
Mm.
for GenSpect
Yes.
on their
Yeah.
Substack
Yeah.
because it is an issue I feel strongly about.
Hmm.
I mean, I consider myself a critical friend of transgender people,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
or if you could say like a critical transgender rights activist in the sense that I don't want transgender people to be harmed.
Yes.
And the transgender people that are adults today,
Hmm.
um, for the most part, didn't have puberty blockers and things like that. So they were able to have families
Hmm.
or or even to change their gender presentation to something else.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think the the activists
Hmm.
are who are I don't think are actually they call themselves allies, but they're not actually friends of transgender people, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And in the same way that Stalin was our ally until he wasn't. It was an expedient
Yeah.
relationship because of a certain circumstance. But I feel like, especially with a lot of them have moved on to being in favor of radical Islam. And Islam is no friend to transgender people around the world.
No.
The example they always come up with is Iran.
Hmm.
But of course, in Iran, gay people are pressured into transition because the alternative is being executed or
Yeah.
imprisoned.
Yeah.
So you would have to be a masochist to think that that was a good thing.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think it's scary how deluded some of the activists are. And as I say, most of them aren't actually transgender themselves.
Yeah.
I think like you should never encourage somebody to remove their genitals
Hmm.
if you wouldn't do it yourself.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's like you got
Exactly.
to have some skin in the game if you'll pardon the pun.
Definitely. And there's absolutely no critical thinking going on, is there? And
No.
there's no willingness to include another perspective or other
Mm.
perspectives. That's what I find most frustrating.
Well, I think it's fair to say there has been a sort of cultural revolution
Hmm.
in that in China, it would have been children denouncing their parents.
Uh-huh.
And now you'll get sort of teenage activists denouncing, skilled and experienced psychotherapists, for
Yes.
example, who
Yes.
with perhaps decades of experience, who've
Yes.
seen all kinds of young people with various stages of distress
Yes.
and have
Yes.
tried to help them.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they are sort of pointing the finger and saying, off to the gulag with you.
Yes.
But it's not a healthy or mature response, obviously.
No. No, it really isn't. So thank you so much, Daniel.
You're
We've
welcome.
talked about so many different things, and I'm really impacted by your cultural knowledge and political knowledge. Thank you so much. You've really put some fat on the bones
Hmm.
for me around these issues. Um, yeah, so thank you so much. I'll put Jen's Spect link
Hmm.
into the this ah, on the video, and also your Substack.
Well, thank you very much.
Is
Yeah,
there anything else you'd like me to put in there?
um, well, I think if people follow the articles that I'm reading, I've got a lot more to say on this topic.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
series that I'm writing for Gen Spect at the moment is called Gender as Religion.
Yes.
And that's going from the sort of the Christian Gnostics
Yeah.
all the way through to some of the issues about colonialism
Hmm. Hmm.
that I've been talking about, because
Yes.
there is a lot to write about on that topic. But
Hmm.
I mean, sort of in a nutshell, I do see this as a religious movement,
Yes.
the activism.
Yes.
Not necessarily the transgender people
Yes.
themselves, because
Yes.
they almost exist independently
Hmm.
from the ideological movement. But yeah, there's a very religious aspect to it, and
I
that's what I'm
also
writing about.
I read one of your articles today
Mm.
about the Asia. Well, you described it in our interview. Thank you.
Mm.
Um, I also look at activism through a cult lens as well.
Mm.
And I was interested. You talked about colonization as having influence,
Mm.
and I just wonder whether some of it is undue influence.
Well,
Um,
absolutely. Ultimately, we have to decide what's good for people, I
yeah,
think, and
yeah,
we can't just let ourselves be bullied or intimidated into keeping quiet about the harms that we see.
exactly, exactly. So,
Mm.
thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.